I would now like to introduce Karen Maxwell, who is a Jewish representative on the UK Women of Faith Network's Coordinating Committee of Religions for Peace. Karen was born and raised in Manchester in the Orthodox Jewish tradition. Karen moved to London and joined the liberal Jewish synagogue, which she found to be more aligned to her values of inclusion. Her interest in interfaith prompted her to study for a diploma in interfaith dialogue from the Wolf Institute. She is one of the founding members of Nisha Nasim, the Jewish and Muslim Women's Network, and a member of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. She has her own interfaith family, as she is married to Martin, who is Church of England, and their two sons have been raised in both faiths. And just to finish it off, her dog is agnostic. So Karen, take it away, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravinda. Thank you for the lovely start to our evening. And I feel delighted and quite overwhelmed, really, to be introducing our panelists who have all used their incredible skills and passion to empower and enable change within their communities and also across communities. For me, they really embody the adage, if you want something doing, ask a busy person. And if you want something doing really well, ask a busy woman. And for me, they're not just inspirational women, they are inspirational people. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. And first of all, I'd like to introduce Maureen Seer, who is of the Baha'i faith. Maureen has worked in the interfaith field for over 20 years and is currently the director of Interfaith Scotland. Prior to working in Scotland, she taught sociology at the University of Samoa in the South Pacific, probably a little bit warmer, I would guess, than where you are currently, Maureen, which was whilst you were doing your doctoral research. She's married with 4 children and 7 grandchildren. So big welcome to Maureen. Secondly, I would be delighted to introduce Laura Marx Obe, who is of the Jewish faith. Laura is an interfaith activist and consultant. Amongst many other things, she founded Mitzvah Day in 2008, and then in 2016 co-founded Senesch, a national Muslim Jewish women's network, and subsequently various other women's alliance groups. She chairs the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust and is a regular contributor on radio and TV. She has 3 children, 2 dogs and 1 husband. I'm hoping I got that the right way around, Laura. And finally, I would be delighted to introduce Trishna Singh Obe, who is of the Sikh faith. Trishna is the founder / director of Sikh Sanjog, the only Sikh family support charity in Scotland, and Punjabi Junction social enterprise, the first Sikh women's social enterprise in Scotland. She's also the first Sikh woman in Scotland to have received an OBE, which happened in 2014. So I am delighted to say these wonderful women are our panelists this evening. And so I'm going to make a start with the first question. And probably what I will do is I'll ask the question, well, I'll move around who I ask it of first for each question. So the first thing I would be really interested to hear is what triggered you to start on your path of social activism? What were the issues that you noticed and what did you want to change? And maybe Maureen, could I ask you to comment on that first off, please?
Yeah, it's funny because you don't think of yourself necessarily on a path of social activism. But I'm thinking back, and when I first saw this question, because they were sent to us earlier, I had to really think about it quite a bit. And And I realised that my upbringing in the Highlands of Scotland, in a town called Elgin, I don't know if any of you know, it was a very working class upbringing. And I can remember as a teenager, you know, my dad coming home from the pub at sort of 10, 10:30 at night and saying, you know, where's my dinner? You know, is it ready? And, you know, I want my dinner now. And my mum rushing off, scurrying into the kitchen and bringing the food out and putting it in front of him, and him going, it's a bit dry and burnt. And I remember anger as a teenager, thinking, this just doesn't feel right. You know, this is just wrong, and there's no way I'm ever going to live like that. But I didn't have any language to properly articulate it. I wasn't, you know, didn't have any particular education, and I just had a gut feeling something was out of sync with that. And you know, it was also, it was, you know, as a teenager, it was the 1970s, and I mean, racism was just the norm. Sadly, my dad had worked in Africa, in various parts of Africa, and you know, gone out there as kind of the, I would say not the boss, but certainly as a worker for Balfour and Beatty, putting up, you know, electric cables and things. And when he would return home after a year abroad, and then he'd be home for a couple of months, and you know, the language that he used was racist. And again, I didn't have any proper way to articulate that I felt that what he was saying was wrong, you know, and wasn't right. And you know, I just wasn't really able to articulate that. And then possibly I was a peculiar child, because at 17, I actually became a Baha'i, and I'd say I was the first Baha'i in the village, so to speak. Definitely in Elgin in the 1970s. The Baha'i faith is a fairly new religion anyway, and there was no other Baha'is there. But you know, when I'd gone to an exhibition that had been up in something called the Museum Hall in Elgin, and I was out with a friend in the park, and I thought it was a bonsai exhibition. I had no idea. I thought I was going to look at small Japanese plants. But I remember going into that exhibition and reading things like, you know, that the founder of this religion, Baha'u'llah, had said men and women were equal in the eyes of God and always have been, and that it was one human race, and that we should not have any prejudice towards people of other, you know, of other races, that all religions had, you know, were equally, had a right to exist, and were there was one God, and just lots of different ways of expressing that, and different ways in culture and history, and just being profoundly impacted by that at 17. And so it would have been, you know, I became a Baha'i within a few weeks actually, and I was left home at 17, surprise, surprise, really. Moved to Aberdeen, and then I suppose the social activism was just promoting the, you know, the fact that these were things that I really believed in, and talking about them, and you know, being engaged in that way. And you know, at a young age, really, I got married and had four children by the time I was 26. So, you know, and no education, because I'd left school at 15. So although the Baha'i faith gave me lots of language to say very positive things about the world and about life, it was only many years later, when my youngest child went to school, and I decided to go to university. And, you know, and that took quite a few years to get the qualifications to get to university. And there was lots of ways of engaging in social activism. I remember organising an Aberdeen Says No to Racism march, and I got involved in Aberdeen Interfaith Association, and I took women's studies, and then I think there was something so powerful about education giving me the voice for the sense of injustice at the way that society was functioning at that time. And my dad wasn't peculiar. I mean, it was the norm. I mean, it was still my dad, and I love him, and he's passed away now. But I don't mean that as a slight on my father. That was actually the social norm, and so it was knowing that those were the social norms, and then going through a process in my own life of getting the tools, if you like, to be able to be active in what I already fundamentally believed in my heart. That was a bit long-winded, sorry.
That's lovely. That was lovely, Maureen. I think we were talking a bit before and saying, you know, the language thing I think is really key. We didn't know what it was we were doing, but we, you know, this label kind of emerged. So yes, I'm sure other panelists will have experienced similar things. So could I pass on now, Laura? Would you like to make your comments on that?
Mute. So mine was quite different. I had one of those aha moments, where you suddenly say, "Oh, this is what I'm going to do." So I had a career in advertising and marketing, and that's what I did. And then we went to live in America. We went to live in America because of my husband's work. I didn't want to go to America. I had no interest in going to live in Los Angeles, but off I went and gave up my work and everything. 3 small children, and we got very involved in our synagogue because I didn't have a lot else to be doing. So I got involved in our synagogue, which was called Temple Israel of Hollywood. Would you believe? Really was. We had a thing called a Mitzvah Day. And if you Google it, you find all over America, a lot of the most progressive, in terms of religiously progressive synagogues, had a day of good deeds. And not only at our synagogue did they have a day like this, so they were all randomly spotted around America, but it was done with people from other faith groups. And we were sent, my family, my husband plays guitar, and so we were packed off to the old people's home in downtown Los Angeles on a Sunday afternoon in November, which was a bit grim. It's sort of no man's land, really, was then anyway, to this old people's home for people from Korea. And with about 3 other families and lots of small children and tambourines and chaos, as you do when you have a family of small children, to entertain these old people, to try to give them a lovely day. Anyway, we found ourselves there. We couldn't communicate with them. We didn't know what was going on. We tried every song in the book and eventually realized that they, like us, knew the Beatles. So we spent a couple of hours banging the tambourines, dancing, walking around, singing Beatles songs. And I realized that all of a sudden this was getting through to these people, and that their hands were tapping and they were nodding along, and some of them were singing and some of them got up to dance. And I realized that it was getting through to my children. So my children, who were only small at the time, I think 2 to 6, they got it too. They understood, even at that tiny age, that they were making a difference to these people who for them must have been ancient. I mean, they were pretty old to me, but and they realized, and the elderly people realized, and I realized. And that moment was when I decided that was what I was going to do. I was going to become a social activist. And I used all of the skills that I'd learned in 20, 30 years of marketing, because I've been working in advertising and marketing. I realized I could use those skills because I could help provide people with something that people want, which is a way to get involved in social activism. And that was the birth of Mitzvah Day, which is now in about 30 countries around the globe altogether on one day. But it was that moment where I realized that this was what I wanted to do with my life.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's interesting, the music thing. Definitely, music is an amazing medium for kind of connecting people. So, very smart. And thank you. Thanks very much. And now, Trishna, could I ask you to comment?
Well, yes, I was born in Glasgow. My parents came to Scotland in the week of the partition of India. So they arrived here in the late 1940, around about the end of 1948. So myself and my siblings were all born and brought up in Glasgow. So we were that first generation born and brought up in Scotland. And we were surrounded by the Sikh faith and things like that. But we were very isolated in that sense. We didn't know we didn't know the difference between what women's rights were. And similar to Maureen, I watched all of that kind of, the culture, the internal culture of the Sikh community, how they lived in the villages that was planted here. So growing up from a very early age, I found it quite difficult to watch. So and then the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple, was, and by 1958 there was a Gurdwara in Glasgow, and that was where most of the Sikh community congregated. And it was from attending there on a regular basis with my parents that we watched and I observed other women from the Sikh community grew larger, and people were coming in. There was more immigrant people coming in to Glasgow. So for me, growing up and watching how the differences were between the upbringing that we had as girls from parents who came from the very rural areas of India and who were considered as village folk, so their customs were very different to the new influx of people that were coming in. So my observations of growing up, you know, at the age of 5, 6, 7, just watching how the women behaved, how the women from the other Sikh community kind of behaved, and how my mother and our, you know, peers we were always restricted and what we could do, what we couldn't do. And there was always this kind of thing about, but this is the way we do it, if you questioned anything. So growing up, it was really difficult, all of these things. And I used to think to myself, why does nobody ask, when you ask the question, why are we not allowed about education or even taking part in things? And it was always, this is the way it is. So nobody answered those questions. And going to the Gurdwara, our family was very committed to, my father was very educated and he was part of the committees that ran the Gurdwaras in Gadot, but the women were always in the background. So people like my mom, you never saw them going forward, but we would observe other women coming forward. And there was, you know, we were actually kind of like completely living a village lifestyle at home. So education and everything that other people had access to in the 60s through education, our education was limited. We were allowed to go to school, but I actually had to leave school at the age of 13 because that was the culture of the community. And so for me, there was always this question of why. And then going to the Gurdwara and then listening to what was being said in the scriptures about equality and everything, this used to really upset me, and I used to question it and, you know, ask my mother that why is this, why are we having to be so restricted? So I didn't know that at that point I was actually becoming a social activist. I didn't even know at that time. But it was kind of always questioning and thinking, how do we make change? How can we change things? And over the years, it came to the stage where you thought nobody else was going to come. Nobody came, none of the other women came forward to our community of women to encourage or support or say to them that perhaps you can try this. So that was always going on. I got married at the age of 21 and I moved to Edinburgh, and I had been married for about 10 years. I had 2 sons at that time. I have 4 children, but my youngest son was involved in a car accident and he died in 1984. And for me, that was the catalyst when I realized that actually we're invisible to the external community. But in some ways, we were invisible internally as well, because when I was looking for support, I was offered support, but it wasn't, people couldn't understand the culture. And internally, I was told by my mother and my mother-in-law that this is the way it was. And then I had 2 daughters. And when I looked at my daughters, I thought, I cannot sit back and allow them to go through these cycles of, you know, being held back from education, from everything. And it was always just because there was no answer. There was never any clear answer. There was always this. And that's when I decided that I would need to do, if we wanted any change, then we would have to make that change ourselves. And then that's how, you know, nearly 30 years ago, that I kind of, with myself and some other women, we got together and we created Sikh Sanjog. And we built it on the basis of making sure that it was accessible to the women from our community. So we took on board all of our internal cultural barriers that nobody else could see, and to make it a safe space. And it was, you know, and over the years, it was very challenging. I had left school at 13, so I had no formal education. I went to university at the age of 51, and I did a degree in community learning and development. And, you know, that was after nearly, I don't know, about 10, 15, 20 years of actually working in community development. But all of these things happened, and it was kind of like a process, and we felt that, but the women from our community didn't even know that they were being held back, because everything was just so, this is the way it is, and this is the way it goes on. But the main thing that I felt really, that really pushed me was the fact that there was no, you know, we were always waiting for somebody to come. Even, like my mother died 35 years ago, and when they were younger, when they were here, there was not that extended hand from any other community of women to actually help them, to lift them out of that. It was a form of discrimination. And so for me, it's always been, it was that inside me. And then, like I said, I mean, I've known Raminda for a long time, and Maureen also. And when people say things like you're an activist, actually, I didn't know. But I very early on, from the age of 5, I was questioning whether it was in my head or openly with my mother. I have 2 sisters who are older than me, and they both were kind of like, I was the troublemaker. But if we hadn't, our women would not have been on any platform at all, or even been visible,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Trishna. I mean, it's interesting again, some of the similar themes coming through about, as women of that generation, some of the things that we were noticing that everybody else was putting up with and we were questioning. So it's very interesting to see that same theme that's come through what each of you have said about seeing something and saying, why don't we? Let's get on with this. And I think that's very much sort of characterized the sort of work that you've been doing. So thank you very, very much for that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. I'd be very interested to hear if we sort of think a bit more about our faiths. And I think, there are probably some very evident from what you've already been saying, experiences within some of our faiths where women are not empowered. But I'd be really interested to hear if you can sort of share with us the ways in which our faiths do empower women, whether that comes from our scriptures, from historical precedents. I know within the Jewish faith, there are a lot of very strong women role models, but maybe there are just examples of inspiring women from our cultural experiences as well. So really, the question is how does your faith tradition empower women? Maybe Laura, could I ask you to start with your views on that?
So Karen, when you sent this, am I on mute? No. When you sent this question, I was a bit floored actually, because I thought, oh, well, I'm not sure that it does. I'm not sure that it does. So that was my start point. And then I thought, okay, I can do better than this. I must be able to do better than this. So I went to the matriarchs. So in Judaism, there are the patriarchs and there are the matriarchs. And the matriarchs that we tend to talk about are Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel. But there's also Hagar, Bilhah, and Zilpah, who we talk about less. And I thought, okay, there's 7 matriarchs there. What do they teach me? But of course, many of the stories we hear about them, or all the stories we hear about them, were told by men. So as Judith Plaskow said, these women are not absent, but they're cast in stories told by men. So, our whole knowledge of them, our whole perception of them is what men have told us about them. And that's true of other biblical figures. So, for example, Miriam, the sister of Moses, she helped the women cross over the Dead Sea. There were all sorts of women in the Bible. There was Deborah, who was a judge. There was Esther, the story of Esther, who it was the Purim story, and Queen Esther, she stood up for women. And so there are great biblical role models in Judaism. But then I thought I probably should go a bit more current than that. So I started doing a bit of research and having a look around, and started, of course, coming up with people from all sorts of different forms of life or forms of the community. So there are obviously there are nowadays women rabbis who I can draw inspiration from. There's my own personal role models, my grandmother, my mother, my sister, personal role models. But there's all sorts of other interesting people as well. So if I look back to heroines, and I come to Hannah Senesch, and she was a poet, and she was a heroine of the Holocaust. She was parachuted in by the British Army to Yugoslavia to try and rescue Hungarian Jews from Auschwitz. She was eventually caught, tortured, and murdered. And she was a poet, and her songs and her poetry live on, and we sing them today. Then there is Anne Frank, of course, another modern day, relatively modern day heroine, a young woman who was brave, who was forward looking, a young girl who ended up also murdered in the Holocaust, but taught us so much about the power of women and what we can do. Moving on to completely different worlds. What about music? Carole King or Barbra Streisand, Jewish women who have inspired us by their control of music, their ability to write it, to sing it, to inspire us with their music. Literature, I thought of Judith Kerr, and we've all read her books or read her books to our children or our nieces and nephews. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was very big in the news last year as the first Jewish female High Court judge, Supreme Court judge in America. And she said, women will only have equality with men when the responsibility of bringing up the next generation is shared. So she was on it. She was an absolutely inspirational Jewish woman. Another one in terms of an actress and also an activist is Tracy Ann Oberman, somebody who we all know. She's also taken a very, very serious role in the fight against anti-Semitism and has been a very brave campaigner on that. That's not an easy place to be. In the world of business, Sheryl Sandberg. In the world of movies, Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman. But I want to end up with one that none of us probably know. I didn't know until I started researching this. A woman called Emma Lazarus, who was a 19th century poet. And her poetry is found engraved to the Statue of Liberty. And what she wrote there was, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And I thought, in terms of a social activist Jewish woman, she was the one who really did it for me.
That's fantastic, Laura. Thank you. I mean, I lots of names that I knew, lots of names I didn't know, but I really appreciate the research that you did on that. So thank you. Very interesting in terms of inspiring us, and it'd be interesting to know how their Jewish faith informed the work that they did as well. So thank you very much. Trishna, could I ask you to go next?
We kind of, within our scriptures, Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh faith, actually accorded equality to women since the 15th century. So in our scriptures, there is a passage that from woman, man is born, within woman, man is conceived. To woman, he is engaged and married. Woman becomes his friend through woman. The future generations come. When his woman dies, he seeks another woman. To woman, he is bound. So I call her bad. From her, kings are born. From woman, woman is born. Without woman, there would be no one at all. Now that's been there embedded in our scriptures, and yet the equality is still hard fought by for women. I mean, we have many women within Sikh history. For example, there was Mai Bago, and she was the first Sikh woman warrior. And you know, during her, in her time, the year 1750, there was a great battle. And 40 Sikh soldiers abandoned their posts and returned to their village. And it was Mai Bago that turned to them and said, "You will not abandon the fight, you will return to the fire, and I will lead you." So she donned a turban, mounted a horse, and with a sword in her hand and fire in her eyes, she led them to where no one else would. And the story is that the 40 deserters who followed Mai Bago back into the battlefield all died. But, you know, they're remembered on these, you know, this story is told through the generations. But actually, similar to what Laura said, these stories were told to us or recited to us when we went to the Gurdwara, and it was always men. There was, you know, Sahib Kaur, who was at the age of 18, the first Sikh woman to become Prime Minister of Patiala. And you know, that was in 1793. And she played a really prominent part in the history of you know, the Sikhs in Punjab. And she, you know, from 1793 to 1801. So that was the first time globally that there was a woman who became a political leader of a region. And then just recently, through our research and things, we've discovered that Princess Sophia Jinda Alexandra Dalip Singh was the daughter of Maharaja Dalip Singh, the last Maharaj of the Sikh Empire. And he was also adopted by Queen Victoria and was brought over here, and he settled in Perthshire. But she was involved with the suffragette struggle alongside Emmeline Pankhurst at that time. But these were things that we didn't know about. What we were, you know, everything was always at the Gurdwara. You heard these stories, and as I said, it was always men that were reading them out. So you didn't really see a physical role model there as you know, teaching or telling women stories about women. It was always the men. And then again, you come back to the fact that you know, sometimes on a personal level, I think we look to the historical aspect of role models, but also for me, it's been actually looking at the women from our own, you know, lives, and like our mothers and grandmothers. I mean, they were our inspirations, but we didn't even know it. They came here in the 40s and 50s, as I said, because of the partition, and they were the hidden heroines. You know, they suffered so much. They suffered discrimination internally and externally, but they fought lots of invisible battles, but they were never recorded. No one ever gave them the time to ask them what they went through, what they were doing, and most of these women are now dead. But they kept their culture and their traditions, and you know, they kept that alive, and that's why we now, you know, 50, 60 years on, we're able to understand and learn more about our religion and culture in the way that they taught us verbally. But basically, I mean, when I think about it, we've had empowerment since the 15th century, and we heard about the Sikh women who fought in the battles and ruled kingdoms. But this was, as I said, always passed on by Gyanis or Gurdwaras. So I think there's something there that's still not correct about the way we hear our history. Even now, there are many Sikh women across the globe that are doing many prominent things, even in India, but we don't hear about them in the way that you would read about other women in history. And it's, yeah, and it's, you know, you wonder how the future generations will be able to relate to this.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Trishna, I think it's something I wasn't aware of at all, but I think it's very, very interesting thing that you shared with us, that as you say, women were empowered and had an equal role from 15th century, and yet there is still this, you know, even now, this prejudice and discrimination. So I think that, you know, we've still got a way to go, I should probably.
I have to say, even although it's been there embedded in the scriptures, it wasn't until about 25 years ago that when I kind of took an interest and started reading, that I actually found out that we have had equality since the 15th century, but nobody bothered to tell us about it because it was men.
Okay, thank you very much, Trishna. So if I can hand that question now to Maureen, please share some of your
Thanks,
thoughts.
Karen. Gosh, those have been such inspirational stories already. I don't even know where to begin to follow that. I was thinking of, within my own faith tradition, you know, as a Baha'i, the equality of men and women it's just one of those things that's just absolutely taken for granted. But of course, coming from the background that I did, I had to kind of learn how to live that, learn how to be that, you know what I mean? Because we do inherit all our cultural baggage. But so I suppose the women that have inspired me have been really, there was one woman called Tahiri, who's at the very early stages of the Baha'i faith, and she was murdered for talking about the emancipation of women, and, you know, that women shouldn't be oppressed and women should have equal rights to education and all of those things. And her, it's recorded that, you know, her dying words were, "You can kill me if you like, but you will never stop the emancipation of women." So, you know, there was those kind of powerful things echoed in me as a young girl of 17. But probably one of the people who impacted on me the most as a young woman, I think I'd mentioned that, you know, the culture around the 1970s in the northeast of Scotland was, well, particularly in the kind of, family situation and wider, was quite racist. And so I decided I'd be quite radical and I would pack my bags. I worked 3 jobs for a year and a half, saved enough money, packed my backpack and went off to Malawi on my own, went off to Africa on my own, because I had this sense that although I'd intellectually accepted that, you know, like that what Patiala said about it being one human race was absolutely right, I was frightened that the racism that I'd heard growing up was still somewhere in me. And I thought the only way to challenge that is to get out of this culture, go somewhere that's, you know, that isn't white. Malawi wasn't white, and live it and be there and just know in my with all my being that that somehow, you know, that the world is one human race. And when I got to Malawi, I was very early on introduced actually to an American lady called Suzanne Locke, who is a Baha'i, and she was just incredible. I mean, she had a hat built in a village. You know, her daughter was home educated so that she could be there in the village. She spoke fluent Chichewa. She was as African as any American could be, if that makes sense. You know, and there was something about the way that she lived and embodied her absolute belief that it was one human race, and the courage that it took for her to do that, that really it was just a joy to be with her. It was a joy to live. I mean, when I was in Malawi, the whole time I was just living in African village. In fact, my dad said, "You're going to be murdered. You're going to be murdered." That was his, you know, the sense that if, you know, as a 19-year-old wandering around the villages of Africa, I would somehow or another come back dead or not come back at all. And of course, that was absolute nonsense, because what I experienced there was more kindness, more love, more. I mean, it was just totally life transforming for me, and I think it was the courage of someone like Tahari, who was willing to die for her beliefs, and the courage of someone like Suzanne, who was willing to really live for her beliefs, that just made me feel that somehow within your faith tradition, when you see things that are empowering and enriching and ennobling, that you've got to just find a way to live it, you know, that it's not enough to just believe it. And they were certainly huge examples of that. And then in our kind of more recent history, there was an amazing Baha'i called Martha Root, who decided that she was just going to spend her life, and this would have been in the 19th. Should probably have written it down. See, the rest of you did your research really well. I think probably it would have been in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, all her life actually. She just packed up and traveled the world. I mean, her mission was to share the message of Patiala with people, you know, that was her thing. But her courage in doing it, you know, she went to places that women just didn't go, you know, and she went on her own. And last night I made a list of the kind of countries that she visited, and it was something incredible, you know, like 50, 60 countries, you know, just trekking around on her own, doing her thing. And I think I've always had a bit of a wanderlust as well. So she was the example for me when it was, you know, as a mum of 4 kids and deciding that we were going to sell our home, pack up and go live in a Pacific island for 5 years. It was someone like Martha that I thought, well, she could do it. She could travel the world. She could live in all these different cultures and relate to people in a really warm and loving way. Then I can do it too, you know. So there's been a lot of inspiration within my own faith tradition. But I would say Tahari from history, and Martha Root in a way from history as well, and then Suzanne from just my own personal experience of being with someone who really embedded their beliefs and it within themselves. They've just been great role models for me. And I'm sure there's many others I can think of, but that's enough for now.
Thank you, Maureen. It's really interesting because the word you used that seemed to be a running theme was the word courage. It's an interesting thing for us to think about, kind of our own courage and what gives us courage and who inspires us with courage. And when we observe courage in other people, does it sort of rub off on us? So it's a very interesting kind of theme running through, I think, a lot of what we're talking about this evening. So thank you very much, Maureen. Can I just hand over? I think Ravinda, there was something that you wanted to add on this area.
The other thing, a lot of women, like Trishna said, don't know what is written in their scriptures about the honor and status of women. And so we made an exhibition and a booklet called The Dignity of Women, Scripture Reflections, looking at the scriptures from the 9 different world religions. so that women can empower themselves. So please, if you would like a copy of that, I can send that to you. So don't think that there aren't positive sort of verses from the different scriptures of the world's religions. You can use them as a tool if men are sort of misrepresenting the religion as and the true religion really says something else. So I think there's a difference between what is in the scriptures and what has been conveyed culturally. So we need to have our voices being out there saying, no, this is not what the scriptures say, and challenge men when they misrepresent the religious scriptures.
Thank you, Ravinda. I think it's this courage to challenge. The sort of the third question that I'd really like us just very sort of briefly to touch on is how have you overcome any of the barriers that your faith tradition might have thrown up? So I'm specifically interested if, we talked a bit about some of where some of our faiths seem to present barriers to us. And if you have one or two tips or ideas or thoughts about how you've overcome those barriers, and which might be interesting to sort of enable us to have the courage to do that challenging. So Trishna, would you be happy to kick off that short discussion?
For me, it was I started off with reading the scriptures to understand them myself. And I read it over and over again, and it made me see there was many passages, as Ravinda said, in the scriptures, but there were some that kind of resonate with you, and you can use them. So I read, and there is like the first passage that I read out about the equality of women, and then there's one that kind of says that the person who oppresses the oppressor is committing a sin. But if you remain oppressed, you're also committing a sin, because God's given you the courage and the strength, that's the same that's instilled in men, within you as well, and you should stand up for your rights. So for me, that was, it was kind of like Ravinda will understand in Punjabi, anybody else that does that, Baap karan wala bhi papi, the baap sehn wala bhi papi. And so for me, those words were really, I ingrained those in my mind. And then I applied some of those to my day-to-day life. And then throughout the years, that's been some of the wording that I've used to encourage other women to be able to step out and stand up for themselves. And I think the scriptures gave me that strength to challenge the community. And sadly, it was male and female that I had to challenge. And it was, although at times through our work, I was encouraging women to forget their own cultural traditions and become more Western, and yet our scriptures were so clear about all of this, and people were just, and the other thing that I did was also create a very thick skin around myself. I used to think, I used to say that I've got I hide like an elephant, because there were so many rumours and so many things that were going on, spreading in the community about what we were doing, what we were trying to do, how we were influencing women. But, and then there's the second chapter that was one of the other things that I read, and it was, and I'll read it in English, but in the Punjabi way it sounds, but I'll just read it out to you, because I read this over and over again, and this is what I used as my motto, you might say. So it was, "Dear God, grant my request so that I may never deviate from doing good deeds, that I shall have no fear of the enemy when I go into battle, and with the determination I will be victorious, that I may teach my mind to only sing your praises, and when the time comes, I should die fighting heroically on the field of battle." And in life, there are many variations of what battle is. And in 1699, that was on the battlefield. Our 10th Guru read that passage out to his soldiers and his warriors and everything. But in 1989, for me, when I founded Sikh Sanjog, it was an invisible impression that we were fighting. Nobody knew about it, nobody could touch it, nobody could explain it. So it was taking that sort of personal responsibility for myself and looking at how we could support women. And, even today, we've got lots of women, the Sikh women hesitate to participate in their local gurdwaras. The gurdwara is the hub for the Sikh community. That's where everything goes on about the community, things happen. And yet the women don't come forward to take part in those. They're encouraged in some ways, but there's always that pull to the back to think that, oh, I shouldn't be on that stage. We don't see women performing the services, holding the services, taking the services, and yet they have that equality. And there's many women that have all of those, they have all of the understanding of how to perform and how to do this. And even sadly, I mean, even in the Golden Temple, which is the seat of Sikhism, of of everything, and yet even there, with all of this embedded in our scriptures, we still have men dominating that, and women are not allowed to lead the service there or take part in it. And that's it's sad when you have something that is so clear in its teachings, and we have been held back. So for me, these passages are very, very important, and they've helped me and given me the strength and courage to not to be afraid and stand up, and not to be afraid to say to other women that we're not going against your religious, cultural values. You're actually, you have them, they're in your hand, and you should be using them.
Yeah. No, Trishna, I think that's fascinating. I think it's that not allowing ourselves to think that somehow we're going against our faith by doing this, and it's actually embodied in the Sikh writings, and I think we'll find that across the board in terms of most religions. I know, talking to my friends from the Muslim community, they say a lot of the things that we believe are actually not in the Quran. So thank you very much. So if I could hand over now, Maureen, if you've got a few words to say on this subject.
I was thinking barriers within, it's almost like the faith, my faith has broken down so many barriers, and I was sort of kind of trying to rack my brains to think, has there been a time where, and actually there was something almost the opposite but it still was about cultural barrier in a way, and it was when we were in Samoa, and we have something called a Baha'i Convention, where we elect men and women to serve on our National Assembly, to guide the national affairs of the community. And of course, I was doing my research on women and religion in Samoa, and I had, uncovered all sorts of things and other faith traditions that needed challenged and looked at, and Samoan women were with me doing this, and it was all great. And then I had to look with new eyes at my own faith tradition and sort of think, are there barriers here too? I just wasn't finding them until it's only once a year this national convention is, and I go to the national convention. I've been to lots of national conventions in the UK, and there's lots, women and men are absolutely equally, go forward as delegates are voted to go forward as delegates to national convention. So then I saw the delegates go forward for the Baha'i National Convention, and someone that was all men. I was thinking, what's going on here? This is bonkers. Where on earth would you have every single delegate as a male? This is not the Baha'i way. Men and women equal in the faith, and this is just, I'm not getting this, and I was really perplexed and kind of, struggling with what's going on here. So of course I was there doing a PhD, so it was my job to unpick all this and to find out what exactly was going on. And what in Samoa, they have a traditional culture, and they have chiefs at the village level, and they're called Matai. And a Matai is elected by his extended family. Say there's 60, 70 people in an extended family, they'll choose, generally speaking, male. 93% of these chiefs are men, to represent their family in the village council. So every extended family has a chief, a Matai, that will represent them at the village council. So when it was time to vote for the delegates for a Baha'i election, traditional cultural things just kicked in, and they thought, well, we can't not vote for our Matai, because that would be such an insult for them not to be chosen as a delegate to National Convention. So in a way, the traditional culture had trumped the Baha'i, which is, I guess, what Trishna is saying about, it's there in the scripture, it's clear as day, there's, you know, I mean, it's very, very clear in Baha'i scripture about the equality of men and women being absolutely engaged in all forms of things. So, so I did challenge it, and actually, you know, the international governing body of the Baha'i Faith wrote and said they were really concerned that the process then, of course, was all these men then voted for men to be on the National Assembly. That there was something seemed skew with here, you know, that wasn't the words they used, of course, but and so I had sent them the research and how I had this is what I had uncovered, whether I was entirely accurate or not. My sense was that I was, and they addressed it very quickly. You know, we have advisors called auxiliary board members and councillors who then said, you know, traditional Indigenous culture is a really valued and wonderful thing, but the teachings in our faith are so explicit about that needing to be that equality of men and women serving at all levels of society, that you know, we're asking you to hold workshops and to have, you know, lots of engagement with that, and within a very short space of time, I'm happy to say that the delegates at the National Convention in Samoa are men and women, and the National Assembly are women. But it's quite interesting that it needed, in a way, I suppose I mean, although I absolutely love Samoa, I was an outsider. You know, I'd stepped into a liminal space and I was looking with fresh eyes at something that people there were taking absolutely for granted because that was the cultural norm. And I was going, that's not the cultural norm within our faith tradition. So what's happening here? And it was, you know, so that was a time where I suppose I had seen a barrier and was articulated that I had seen that barrier to women's participation in Baha'i elections, and I had expressed it very vocally and written a paper about it, presented it at a women's conference in Brisbane. It had got through to the international governing body, and then things began to unravel and it was challenged and changed. So I suppose as women we have a role to challenge and change situations when we see them. And luckily, the men, and only once did I have a man say something to me, a Baha'i, that was not the right thing to say. And I was asked to serve as an auxiliary board member. And this particular Samoan man said to me, nobody will take you seriously because you're not a chief and you're a woman. And I said, well, guess what? I'm going to work with the women and children and they'll take me seriously. and then, you know, so there was I mean, I've been a Baha'i since I was 17. So you are talking about a long, long time. These are the only two things that I can come up with at the moment. But still, the one in Samoa was fairly significant because you were talking about a governance structure that wasn't reflecting the teachings of our faith, you know. So culture does impact on religion, and religion impacts on culture. There's a whole symbiotic thing goes on there all the time, and we're always evolving and growing and developing as women, but also faith traditions are always growing and developing and evolving.
Yeah, I think very interesting. Again, the theme that's popped up again and again is this sort of interplay between culture and faith traditions, and where, you know, which, as you say, I love the way you put it, one trumps the other. So yes, very, very interesting. Okay, well, finally, Laura, can I move to you to ask you what your thoughts are?
No surprise that in Judaism we've also got an issue with our men, and no surprise that there's this intersectionality, if you like, between culture and religion and what's in the scriptures, and you know, and whilst many women will think that their perception of Jewish women is that we have got plenty to say for ourselves and we're super confident, I can tell you that when you put us in a room full of Jewish men, the men dominate. I mean, the men dominate. That's where we're at, right? So just to take a slightly different perspective on it, here are some of the things that I've been involved in over the years to try to counterbalance some of this. So research and data. So in 2011, I set up a commission on women in Jewish leadership because of all of these issues. There were no women to be seen. So I led this commission, and we methodically looked at what are the reasons why there are so few women in leadership roles in the Jewish community. And, you know, a lot of these were cultural. Some of them were the things you've talked about misuse of the scriptures in order to keep us in our place, overburdening us with family responsibilities. You know, an enormous amount of it was cultural, but embedded in. So we did this commission and we came up with recommendations to change things. So we went about it quite sort of methodically, and that was quite helpful. And one of the things we came out, for example, was a decision that there should be no more all-male panels in the community. Because how many times have we opened our whatever to find that a panel where every single person is a man, and you think, surely they could find a woman to talk about, surely, even if they cover to a different angle. So we set up a campaign on no more all-male panels. You know, we set about trying methodically to change things. We introduced a thing called a gender equality plan that was intended to be introduced into Jewish organizations to get them to look internally at their own structures of how they hired people, how they promoted people, and to think whether they were gendered in the way they did things. So we did go about things quite methodically, and there's a lot to be said for actually taking the bull by the horn and saying, okay, let's look at this and let's look at it properly. Another whole area is around partnerships. So Nisana Sheen that Karen mentions, Karen's very involved with, you know, it's a Jewish Muslim women's network, a partnership of looking with another faith group or another group of people and saying, what are the similarities here and how can we do it together, and can we work together to do this better? So partnership is a good one. Another one is structures. I'm a great believer in structures. So for example, I chair for my sins the Alliance of, I co-chair actually, the Alliance of Jewish Women. And that again is another organization, small organization, but we are there to do something specific, which is to speak for and about women. And again, by having a structure, it enables you to do things in a way that as an individual is much more difficult. And the last one I put down was following others. You know, we have all got mothers and grandmothers who led the way. And in the Jewish community, you know, the Jewish community mostly came to this country around about the turn of the last century. Most Jews in Britain today are Ashkenazi Jews who fled the pogroms and came here around about 1900, as did my family. So I've got grandmothers, or I haven't anymore, but I had grandmothers who were trailblazing in their own way. And all of us, even if it's not our mothers and grandmothers who we look up to as role models, nonetheless, there are women along the way, and we can sort of step on their shoulders, and we then can allow younger women to step on our shoulders. So in terms of structure, it's a ladder.
Thanks, Laura. I think some really good tips, and I know that, you know, we've been involved in discussions together about the sort of support from other communities, which does bring strength. And I think what we've heard a lot this evening is actually some very similar themes and experiences. I mean, obviously there's specific differences to different faith groups and different communities, but I think that kind of that partnering and comparing, and sometimes you realize actually maybe your own community isn't as bad as you thought. So thank you. But I really like you just, you know, maybe one short piece of advice for women that are the next generation of women who are coming through, who are seeing things that they want to challenge and change. What's your one piece of advice to help them keep going, even when they're kind of facing some degree, some barriers or some kind of resistance? Maureen, can I ask you just to, as briefly as possible, answer that question?
Well, I was going to, originally I thought I would say that my advice would be to be hard on yourself and gentle on others, because I think we have to continually be pushing ourselves to grow and develop. But that now doesn't sound quite right when I've listened to everything that I'm seeing. So my advice would be whatever situation that you're facing, still be gentle with yourself and with others. You know, I think it's important.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Trishna, would you like to just your one piece of advice?
I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge, and I think for a future generation of younger women to acknowledge, is actually the saddest part of this struggle is the opposition from women from within your own different faith communities, you know, that women that oppose change. And that's something that I think the younger generation of women, a lot of them are finding difficult. And I think it's to, you know, understand that and be able to challenge it so that then we can make real change. And when women need to start supporting the younger women to help them to move forward, I find that from within our own faith community. But I think each time a woman stands up for herself without knowing it possibly and without claiming it, I think she stands up for all women.
Yeah, oh, that's lovely. That's a lovely thought. Lovely thought to finish on. Thank you, Trishna. And Laura, in addition to the great piece of advice you already gave us, do you have one more piece of advice for the next generation of women?
I wrote down in this post-COVID world 4 C's: kindness. Let's do everything with kindness. Let's do everything that's in line with our culture. Let's do things with compassion, because moving forward, there's going to be a great need for compassion. And finally, collectivity. Let's do it together, collectively, because together we are stronger.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, from my part, it's very, very difficult to try and sum up what's been said this evening, because it's just so many interesting thoughts. And I'm sure, like the rest of you, I will be kind of mulling over it. I know the session's been recorded, but I just, from my personal point of view, just wanted to say a huge, huge thank you to our wonderful panelists, really sharing things from the heart. So I really appreciate that, your honesty and your own insights.
A lot of food for thought in the contributions, and obviously I agree with all of you that we're always seen, those who are challenging men are always seen as troublemakers and not as change makers, but we're not going to stop anyway. No matter what the men say, we're not going to stop. So we need to be the change that we want to see. So let's just all women, let's work together to make a better world for the women who haven't got a voice, so that we can be their voice and make the changes that are required for a much more peaceful world.